Hello there, welcome back to my ongoing attempt to review every single game ever on Steam Deck. For those of you that didn't see my last video, where I took a look at every Siphon Filter game running on the deck, the primary goal of this series is to showcase the unique capabilities of handheld gaming PCs. To do that, we're going to test every single version of every single Midnight Club game on the Steam Deck. If you're new to the series, here's how it works. Via emulation, I test every port of each game released across both console and PC, and then record footage of them via capture card. Based on my own subjective experience, I give each port a compatibility score out of 10 before issuing a final recommendation on which one you should play on Steam Deck. In order for a port to get top marks, it needs to run at its full intended frame rate and feature no major graphical issues. Each port also needs to render at the deck's native resolution. Lastly, I'll be giving each game a little teensy review as we go along. It's like a bonus. It is worth mentioning that these videos take a ton of time to put together, and I do want them to be a service to you. If you like what I'm doing here, give the video a like and maybe even subscribe. If you have a particular franchise that you'd like to see tested on the deck, pause the video and then let me know in the comments. Oh, and as always, I'll only be testing through SteamOS, as that's what the vast majority of users are rocking on their deck. Alright, on to the games. It's difficult to imagine Rockstar Games as anything other than the slightly monotonous behemoth that it is today. The two franchises that it's stuck with, GTA and Red Dead, carry an authority over the industry that even the likes of Half-Life could only aspire to. With that said, there was a time, now nestled in the hallowed annals of gaming history, when Rockstar was a nascent superpower, and no other series distills that period in the company's history quite like Midnight Club. Blending sleek, turn-of-the-millennium aesthetics with tight, refined arcade racing gameplay, the original Midnight Club was released for the PlayStation 2 in the cyber year of 2000 and later for the Game Boy Advance in 2001. Partnering with developer Angel Studios, Rockstar took a very hands-off approach throughout Midnight Club's development, thanks to their faith in the team's technical skills and design talent. You see, Angel had already created the Midtown Madness games on PC, a duo of titles that were A, successful, and B, the creative and technical blueprint for what Midnight Club would become. Taking place across two separate cities, New York and London, Midnight Club pits you, the faceless everyman, against a shadowy band of urban racers in the endless pursuit of inner city domination. In English, that essentially means drive around a big open city, tailgate rival racers, and then race them for clout and cars. It's gloriously uncomplicated and very much screams launch window PS2 title thanks to that simplicity. That's not a criticism, however. Midnight Club very quickly demonstrates the importance of racing well and getting new cars as recompense. It's a very straightforward transaction. Win races, get cars. And all the better too, because Midnight Club is absolutely nails hard. This is one of those instances where I feel blessed to have access to save states. Quickly pinging myself back to the beginning of a race following a dire miscalculation takes the sting out of that difficulty, at least a little bit. You're also frequently given a choice between 2 or 3 different rivals to track down and race, which means you're rarely stuck endlessly replaying one event over and over and over again. Despite the game's gnarly difficulty, Midnight Club actually slowed the creation of this video considerably. If you gatekeep a bunch of fast cars behind very difficult races, I quickly develop a compulsion known as the Midnight Melties. I was firmly committed to beating every single rival and unlocking every single vehicle Midnight Club offers. Thankfully, I was given a way out. I couldn't even keep up with one of the later rivals long enough to begin their race. This signal was enough for me to snap back to reality and then move on to testing. Speaking of which, how does the game perform on its sole home console platform? As is the norm for PlayStation 2 titles on deck, we're running the game via PCSX2, and the results are positive but not completely blemish-free. Midnight Club originally ran at 30 FPS on Sony's sophomore machine. Since I've been making these videos, I've found that the deck's built-in frame rate and VSync combo tends to struggle a little with keeping the frame buffer smooth when emulated games have such a low target frame rate. Thankfully, it doesn't impact the experience too significantly, but you will notice when playing Midnight Club that the frame times slip out of sync at semi-regular intervals before snapping back in order. For the purpose of this segment, you can safely ignore the deck's own frame time graph. Instead, keep an eye on PCSX2's internal graph in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. Sometimes it's absolutely fine, then other times it absolutely isn't, like when beginning a race, for example. Whenever that frame time graph has a cardiac event, you'll also hear the game's audio slow down and contort itself in order to stay in time with whatever is happening on screen. This is expected emulator behaviour, but it is a little distracting when it does happen. Gripes aside, playing the original Midnight Club on deck is a decent experience overall. The visuals are perfect, the game upscales really nicely, and despite PCSX2's often intrusive input lag, the game still feels really satisfying to control on the deck. Taking the rough with the smooth, the minor performance issues that popped up throughout my time with Midnight Club prevent me from giving the game full marks. Midnight Club's PS2 port scores a compatibility rating of 8 out of 10 on Steam Deck. A handheld re-envisioning of Midnight Club would follow the home console version a year after its release, launching for the Game Boy Advance in 2001. And this is that port, in all of its... Would glory be the appropriate word here? Look, say what you will, I know there are plenty of you out there that will look at this and see it as nothing more than a big hot pile of dog eggs, but I would have been chuffed beyond belief to get my hands on this game in 2001. Reformatting Midnight Club into a traditional 16-bit top-down racer, this version of the game was helmed by Rebellion, who you may know for bringing us Sniper Elite. Anyway, I'm running the game on deck via MGBA's RetroArch core. If you configured your emulators via emudeck, then you'll have been given the choice between using either the standalone version of MGBA or its core within RetroArch. I would highly recommend RetroArch in this instance, as I ran into all sorts of VSync related issues when trying to use the standalone app. As is the case with just about every other GBA game ran through this core on deck, this is perfect. No perceivable issues with visuals, audio or controls, and the game upscales really nicely. emudeck's pre-applied LCD overlay is a tasty addition to GBA games on the deck, lending an authentic and cohesive look. In what I'm sure is a shocking surprise to absolutely nobody, Midnight Club's GBA port scores a compatibility rating of 10 out of 10 on deck. A modest pair of ports put through the ringer on deck then. The PS2 version of the game is obviously the gold standard intended vision of what Midnight Club has to offer, and with an 8 out of 10 compatibility rating, you'll have an enjoyable experience revisiting the franchise's point of origin on Steam Deck. If you're nostalgic for the GBA port, a flawless compatibility score carries with it a strong recommendation. Ruthlessly difficult games, but totally worth a play in current year. Thanks to the original Midnight Club being a launch title for the PS2 that wasn't absolute pomp, it was perhaps an inevitability that Rockstar would hit the sequel button. Not only that, but such was Rockstar's enthusiasm in Angel Studio, they straight up acquired the developer, rebranding them as Rockstar San Diego just in time for Midnight Club 2's release. Launching for the PS2, the Xbox and PC in 2003, Midnight Club 2 was a meaningful expansion on what the team had previously put together in time for the PS2's launch. Perhaps the most noticeable uplift could be seen within the sequel's visuals and its art style, which carve out a unique caricatural look for Midnight Club 2 that set it apart from what EA were doing with Need for Speed and Burnout. The sequel's overall tone also leans a little more into the overt Pimp My Ride-esque tuner flavour that would bind itself to later entries in the series. If Burnout was road rash with cars and Need for Speed echoed the Fast and the Furious, then Midnight Club 2 was Exhibit chucking 14 GameCubes into the boot of a VW Polo and calling it a day. Graphics and art aside, it's clear that Rockstar San Diego did the legwork in establishing new ways to make street racing as engaging as possible. A host of new abilities, like being able to shift the weight of your car and hop it up onto two wheels, are initially seen as fun novelties. Reach the game's later, more difficult race events, however, and you'll rely on these new skills just as much as you do on having a steering wheel. Taking place across 3 cities this time instead of just 2, you'll eviscerate rubber in Los Angeles, Paris, and Tokyo. Races get exponentially harder to beat as you progress from city to city, and whilst it's certainly a more accessible racer than MC1 from the outset, it's still absolutely rock hard in terms of difficulty. Not only is the sequel often as ruthless as its predecessor, but there's a new sense of unfairness mixed into Midnight Club 2's formula that I really didn't enjoy. All too often, it felt like my rivals were needlessly aggressive, screwing themselves over just to screw me over. The traffic patterns of regular citizens in each city also feel tuned to make the final minute or so of each race a bit of a coin flip. Nothing spoils a perfectly executed route through an already difficult race like a big lumbering articulated lorry cutting you off at the final intersection. But hey, that's what save states are for. Shifting gears to the testing phase, the first version of the game we're taking a look at is the Xbox port, running here via xemu within Steam OS. Image quality and audio fidelity are surprisingly strong here from the outset, however the game's performance is clearly inexcusable. Not only is Midnight Club 2 running at about half the frame rate that it does on real hardware, but it's also operating at half speed. Now, truth be told, I'm a really big fan of xemu. I think it's an emulator that's being developed the right way, with compatibility topping the list of priorities. At this early stage in its life, though, it just doesn't meet the mark on deck, especially in Midnight Club 2's case. Slow as molasses and practically unplayable, Midnight Club 2's Xbox port scores a compatibility rating of 3 out of 10 on deck. Sitting alongside its Xbox counterpart, we have the PS2 version of Midnight Club 2 also up for assessment. As with the first game, we're running this port via ppsspp within Steam OS, and although decent, many of the faults that blighted the first game's performance within this emulator are back for their encore, plus a couple of new bugbears too. Starting with image quality, and it's mostly acceptable. ppsspp does a decent job these days of deinterlacing the PS2's notoriously grainy output. The overall image is softer than the game's other ports. On the flip side, there are environmental lighting effects present in the PS2 version that weren't featured on Xbox and PC, a frequent byproduct of early 2000s multi-platform development. Performance is as unpredictable as it was in the original Midnight Club. With that said, I'd argue a wobbly frame rate presents a bigger problem in Midnight Club 2 than it did in the first game, thanks to the sequel's blistering speed and twitchy handling model. There were numerous points across my testing where my attempts to effortlessly drift around the LA burbs were scuppered by dropped frames and inconsistent controller response. Speaking of which, ppsspp2's high level of input latency is a real factor in Midnight Club 2. This game is faster than fast, and any additional lag in the pipeline sticks out like a sore paddle shifter. I want to play Midnight Club 2, damn it, not Guitar Hero on the PS3. It's not all doom and gloom, of course. It's okay for the most part, but those drawbacks are really noticeable as you play. Midnight Club 2's PS2 port scores a compatibility rating of 7 out of 10 on deck. The final port of Midnight Club 2 on our to-do list is the PC version of the game, and boy is it an absolute doozy. We're running the game's Windows executable via Proton on deck, or more specifically via Lutris, because you can't actually buy the game via Steam anymore. If you're lucky enough to already own the game on Steam, then you might have an easier time than the rest of us in getting it to cooperate on deck. The primary issue you'll encounter with Midnight Club 2's PC version is controller support, something that it's technically capable of, but reluctant to actually commit to. Getting this game to recognise the deck's built-in controls is an agonising experience. There are a host of different DLLs available on PC Gaming Wiki's entry for Midnight Club 2, none of which worked out of the gate for me. It wasn't until I happened upon a Steam community guide, that I'll link below, that I found a mapping file that kind of worked. I say kind of because after restarting the game once, I lost controller support again. In a final last-ditch attempt to play the PC port of Midnight Club 2 on my Steam Deck, I hopped back over to Lutris and enabled automatic controller configuration for the game, and whether it's been a complete fluke or some unholy byproduct of all of my attempted strategies, it seems to have stuck and my controls now work. They're mapped strangely, X and Y are accelerate and brake respectively, but at least it sort of works. With the exception of that whole ordeal, the rest of the experience is essentially perfect on deck. I did notice some mild audio crackling at points, especially with engine sounds, but that's a complete nitpick in comparison. Performance, image quality, native widescreen support, all of it gets a thumbs up from me. It's impossible to ignore the flaky and elongated setup experience, which is the sole detractor when it comes to our final rating. So all in all, the PC port of Midnight Club 2 scores a compatibility rating of 8 out of 10 on deck. One of 2003's most memorable arcade racers has a muddy presence on Steam Deck. The Xbox port is obviously a complete wash, come back in 10 years on that one. As for the PS2 and PC, the latter is better at a push. If you just want to play the game and you're okay with decent image quality and slightly questionable performance, give the PS2 port a go. If you're willing to tinker and troubleshoot and then tinker again, the PC port offers up a clean and clinical aesthetic, albeit at a flawless 60 FPS. With the San Diego team now a key asset in Rockstar's broader portfolio, over time the studio would become more and more responsible for everything that wasn't Grand Theft Auto. Shipping Red Dead Revolver in 2004, Rockstar San Diego weren't exactly wasting time. A brand new Midnight Club would follow just 1 year later. Launching for the PS2, Xbox and the PSP, 2005's Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition would come to be seen by many as the best game in the series. And in many aspects, that consensus certainly rings true. MC3 was the first game in the franchise to feature actual licensed vehicles, something that was quickly becoming a stamp of legitimacy amongst arcade racers at the time. The intervening period between MC3 and the last game saw the popularity of tuner culture undeniably explode. EA had released Need for Speed Underground 1 and Underground 2, Max Power magazine was selling 250,000 issues a month, and Too Fast Too Furious had tripled its production cost at the box office. The zeitgeist was there to be exploited, and boy did Rockstar San Diego lean into it. Customization sits firmly at the centre of Midnight Club 3. Your car is your canvas, and as long as it looks like a Cadillac Escalade with gigantic spinning rims, or better yet, is a Cadillac Escalade with gigantic spinning rims, all associated street cred is yours for the taking. You'll likely spend just as much time getting busy in the custom shop as you do on the asphalt, and as long as that excites you, then yeah, Midnight Club 3 is great. Featured cities for you to tear arse across include San Diego, Atlanta and Detroit. Noticeably grungier and less glamorous than prior locations in the series, but again, totally rooted in car culture of the time. There is one area in which Midnight Club 3 greatly deviated from its predecessors, and that's difficulty. Transitioning from being the hardest arcade racer on console to the easiest is anything but subtle. Yappy, long-winded tutorials also signal to me that Rockstar's aim for Midnight Club 3 was a larger, more casual audience. Goofy driving abilities are back, and they're still fun. In fact, Franklin's slow-mo driving perk from GTA 5 first made its debut here in Midnight Club 3. GTA 5 would also be the first Grand Theft Auto game that Rockstar San Diego would have a hand in making. About a year after Midnight Club 3's initial release, Rockstar put out an expanded version of the game for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox, subtitled Dub Edition Remix. An extra bunch of cars, events, and the return of Tokyo as an optional career location meant that Remix would come to be considered the definitive version of the game. It also helps that this was a value title. It was only $20 brand new, and like many others, this is how I got a hold of the game at the time. Before we slip into a nostalgic coma, let's see how the game fares on deck. Here's the PS2 port of Dub Edition Remix running via ppsspp within Steam OS. My initial reaction to this version running via emulation was one of disgust and disappointment. Many of the performance-related quirks I had encountered in the first two games were amplified within Dub Edition, so much so that I almost wrote the game off as unplayable. For a giggle, I turned off optimal frame pacing within ppsspp2's settings. This can sometimes help certain games get over the line in terms of performance by preparing frames ahead of time. This made an enormous difference to Midnight Club 3's playability, the only downside being more input latency, an issue ppsspp2 already struggles with. Now, thankfully, Midnight Club 3 isn't as twitchy as MC2, so the added latency doesn't impact the game too severely. Visuals are nicely upscaled and de-interlaced for our pleasure, and there aren't any overt presentational issues to speak of that weren't there on original hardware. So a quick trip to the settings menu saves the day. Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition Remix is only let down by that added latency, which doesn't even really cause an issue anyway. The PS2 port of the game scores a compatibility rating of 9 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Next up, the Xbox port, running via xemu within Steam OS. Do I need to elaborate on why this sucks? This sucks, man. As I previously mentioned, xemu has enormous potential as an emulator. That potential is snugly nestled beneath the broken visual effects and slow motion gameplay you're currently watching, but it is there. When xemu works, image quality is fantastic and controller response is smooth. It also helps that the Xbox ports of 6th gen games were often the superior ports. We'll get there, won't we? It should come as no surprise that Midnight Club 3's Xbox version is also a bust on deck. Awful performance and broken visuals lead the charge in furnishing this port with a 3 out of 10 compatibility rating on deck. The final version of Dub Edition up for consideration is the PSP port running via ppsspp within Steam OS. This particular port of the game is already peculiar to begin with, even before we look at its performance on deck. The PSP received its Midnight Club 3 in line with the original home console release, so it misses out on the extra goodies found in Dub Edition Remix. This is a bummer, but there are some proven benefits to emulating PSP games over emulating PS2 and Xbox ones, primarily performance and compatibility. ppsspp is a very mature and well put together emulator, so compatibility in this case is excellent. For the first time in the series though, that's a bad thing. The source of this dilemma is the game's built-in frame rate target. Midnight Club 3 on PSP actually shoots for 60 frames per second, a benchmark that both ppsspp and the deck itself have no problem meeting. The issue arises when anything complicated starts to happen on screen, such as a race. When this happens, the game itself targets a lower frame rate. Sometimes it's 50 or 40 or 30, depending on the circumstances. This frame rate switch up happens a lot, and whilst the deck can happily hit these moving performance targets, it's a horribly jerky experience. Unfortunately, there's no way to tell Midnight Club 3 on PSP to exclusively target 60 FPS or even 30 FPS. A consistent fixed frame rate would elevate this game to the top of the pile, despite its graphical shortcomings as a PSP title. So, rather oddly, Midnight Club 3 makes it onto my internal no-fly list, despite earning a perfect 10 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. It's as intended, it's just unpleasant. And that's every supported platform's best attempt at Midnight Club 3. The Xbox version should be in top shape, probably in time for the heat death of the universe, I'd say. The PSP port is like running and walking at the same time, and the PS2 version is mostly okay, with the exception of its stodgy input latency. Don't be tempted by the PSP's crisp upscale. For what it's worth, the additional content and consistent performance of the PS2 port make it my personal recommendation. As the 6th generation of home game consoles came to a close, enormous changes swept the industry. 1 to 2 year development cycles were dead, and Rockstar's reliably lively release schedule slowed down to a comparative crawl. Rockstar San Diego kept themselves suitably busy throughout the first few years of the HD era, creating an entirely new game engine and then a table tennis game. In 2008, and after a host of delays, the studio finally unleashed Midnight Club LA for the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360. A heavily tweaked version of the game would later follow for the PSP, titled LA Remix. It would be unfair of me to say that Midnight Club LA is simply more of the same. However, on a fundamental level, that's kind of what it is, with a couple of key caveats. The game doesn't shake up Midnight Club's formula quite as much as its predecessors did. The absence of multiple cities, as hinted at by the title, is arguably the biggest differentiator Midnight Club LA offers, that and its lovely graphics. The game's singular focus on Los Angeles as its vehicular playground has allowed Rockstar San Diego more control over how you progress through the game's career. This has been leveraged to tell something resembling a story, with cutscenes and everything. It's pretty boilerplate stuff, very much a PG version of what Rockstar were doing at the time, but it does serve its purpose despite lacking the unique, caricatural edge seen in the older games. If it sounds like I'm down on Midnight Club LA, I am. For all that the game achieves in terms of style and visual detail, Rockstar San Diego dropped the ball when it came to the fundamentals. There's very little that's truly new here, as I mentioned. In addition, the game is brutally difficult in the cheapest way. Opponents comically slingshot themselves miles ahead of you at the beginning of each race, and you're always battling the fabled rubber band of unfairness. The game's camera also deserves a mention. It's terrible. The FOV is so low across all of the available angles, and after an hour or two, it just feels uncomfortable to play. Whilst it's still reliably fun in short bursts, it's unfortunate that Midnight Club's final entry didn't hit the mark quite like its progenitors. Enough of that whinging. Let's see how the game fares on deck. In the case of the Xbox 360 version, it doesn't. I tried multiple versions of the game within multiple versions of Xenia, and all I got was a lovely black screen. Thanks very much, Xenia. The Xbox 360 version of Midnight Club LA scores a compatibility rating of 0 out of 10 on Steam Deck. As for the PlayStation 3 version, that's a different story entirely. Thanks to RPCS3, we actually get in-game, where we can roam the LA side streets at a peachy keen 9 frames per second. Despite the awful performance, the game actually looks mostly fine, with the exception of some visual bugs on damaged vehicles. Either way, you're not going to actually play the game in this state. If you do, I hope that someday you find happiness. Unplayably bad performance renders the PS3 port of Midnight Club LA as nothing more than a curiosity on deck. This version scores a compatibility rating of 2 out of 10. But wait, there's more. Backing up Rockstar San Diego like some kind of diminutive hype man, Rockstar London came in clutch with a reimagined version of the game for the PSP, and this is that game running within ppsspp. Midnight Club LA Remix is a bit of a hodgepodge. The game's titular city isn't the same one found in the home console versions. It's instead a modified version of Midnight Club 2's LA map. Adding to the bewilderment, the Tokyo map from Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition Remix is here too, just for funsies, I guess. LA Remix does a decent job of distilling the broad brushstrokes of the home version down to the PSP, particularly when it comes to the game's handling model. Its primary drawback is the same one found in MC3's PSP port: performance. As was the case before with Midnight Club 3 on the PSP, the game is constantly choosing new frame rate targets as the action builds on screen. Sometimes it's 60 or 40 or 30, etc. ppsspp has no issue accurately hitting these metrics, but the game itself is too erratic in its performance targets, resulting in jerky, unresponsive gameplay. So again, this is another instance where ppsspp is doing everything right. It's just what constitutes right here is what's causing us problems. Midnight Club LA Remix for the PSP defiantly scores a compatibility rating of 10 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Sadly, Midnight Club LA puts forward one of the poorest results we've seen in this series thus far. Emulating the home console versions is akin to boiling paint and huffing the fumes, and the PSP demake, despite being emulated accurately, feels like playing musical chairs by yourself. We'll need to see some significant advancements in 7th gen emulation before this one can be comfortably enjoyed on the deck. And with every port now put through its paces, that's that. Midnight Club has been one of the more interesting games to cover for this series for a variety of reasons. The main one for me is how much its shifting identity mirrors what was going on in the industry at the time. Over the course of the 2000s, development costs absolutely exploded. Putting out interesting and worthwhile sequels every 1 to 2 years went from being attainable to a complete pipe dream. Midnight Club is a franchise that absolutely fell foul of that shift. I doubt we'll ever see another game in the series again, but there's a healthy amount of timelessness to what's there, and going back to it is definitely worthwhile. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for sticking around if you did, and please consider subscribing. Be sure to tune in next time where we'll be tackling a platforming legend. See ya!